Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm Elizabeth Schwab, the podcast editor and member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs, from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community settings. For our program today, I'm joined by Ava Kreuzschisker from HRE USA and three student activists, Ella Henry, an immigrant rights advocate, Jaya Field, a human rights researcher, and Jude Armstrong, a writer and abolitionist. Together, we'll discuss how education has shaped their activism and what it would take for schools to uphold freedom of expression and dignity.
Thank you all so much for being here today. It is such an honor to listen to your stories. To start off, could each of you tell us a bit about your interest and work in human rights?
Thank you so much for having me today. I'd love to talk a little bit about my background and work in human rights education so far. So I'm from Boise, Idaho. I've lived here for the majority of my life, and I've grown up in a very multicultural household and family. I think from a young age, this pushed me to want to be involved in my community and learn more and be a proactive member of my community. And growing up in Idaho, somewhere where there are a lot of public lands, I was pushed to be involved and learned about climate activism, the importance of preserving the environment. And I got my start with human rights education, learning about that. And as a climate justice advocate, as I grew older, I began becoming more involved in immigrant rights work and housing justice work more recently. I'm currently an immigrant rights intern at the ACLU of Idaho, where I've done research and outreach for anti-immigration legislation pieces in Idaho. And at Columbia University, where I attend, I'm a coordinator for the advocacy team of the Housing Equity Project, where we learn and educate about the gentrification that Columbia does and ways that we can be better members of the Morningside Heights and Harlem community. So those are just some of the ways that I've gotten involved recently. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ella. Jaya, would you like to tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much again for having us here. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think starting off similar to Ella, most of my kind of interest or exposure to human rights was kind of just by virtue of growing up as a queer person, as a woman, as a person of color. And so I've always kind of been thinking about human rights, whether I knew it or not in the moment. I'm from Evanston, Illinois, which is a really progressive city. So I was really lucky to kind of grow up surrounded by a lot of really cool organizing and advocacy efforts, which definitely translated into my high school experience. I've always really loved reading. And so kind of in high school, I formed close relationships with professors in English or history courses who kind of pushed me to see human rights as a valid field of study or career path. So I think because of that, kind of got me to where I am today, where I'm a rising senior at the University of Washington. I'm doing a double major in international studies and law societies and justice. So kind of at the intersection of my majors is just an interest in like the legal side of things of inequality in law, and law as a tool to reduce inequality. So kind of with the international piece, I've been able to study abroad twice. So a lot of my human rights like fieldwork experiences have been abroad, first in Peru and then in Italy. And I've kind of really worked across different issues. In Rome, I was doing disability rights work, but I'm also have done kind of research on queer rights stuff, a lot of like migrant justice organizing just with the administration transition in January. So I wouldn't like kind of put myself in a box of like what I'm interested in. I've luckily found ways to organize across categories.
Thank you so much, Jaya. Jude?
I'm Jude. Thank you so much for having us. I grew up in and from New Orleans, Louisiana, and there we have a really high rate of incarceration. So I grew up around a lot of people who were formerly incarcerated, Some of them were wrongly convicted, some not. But I grew up around them in their organizing, which has been a lot of documenting the conditions in prisons and jails, and also dealing with barriers to reentry and that sort of thing. I've focused on that. I'm currently an intern at Freedom to Grow, which is an abolitionist organization that builds, I think around now we have 5 community gardens around the city that are designed by and run by formerly incarcerated people. And they work to pay livable wages, but also to do research and projects in honor of people who sort of came before us and started that movement. So in addition to that, I also worked a lot with protesting for queer rights in Louisiana for the last 2 or 3 years in high school. In Louisiana, we had a large surge of anti-LGBTQ legislature. So I was a part of a couple protests and an art piece that protested against both like Louisiana's versions of Don't Say Gay bills, some healthcare bills, and then just other barriers to transgender people's like relationship to public life. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jude. The Declaration of Human Rights Education and Training calls for education that empowers all persons to enjoy and exercise their rights. Thinking back to your K through 12 years, did you notice a gap between what you were taught about rights and what you actually experienced in daily life? And if so, can you explain a bit about that? Ella, we'll start with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and as I'm reflecting about my education in Idaho, which I went to public school from elementary school till I graduated high school, I've realized that how history and how education has been taught to me has made it seem like issues of racism, displacement, violence towards Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, other marginalized populations is something of the past in a way, and hasn't made it seem like things are ongoing, and there isn't ongoing displacement of Indigenous communities. There isn't ongoing racism and violence towards Black and Brown people. And realizing that disconnect was made really evident to me, I think, when I was reading history books and teachers and adults would talk to me about history as if racism towards Black people was something that has only happened in the past and wasn't happening now in Idaho, a state that is predominantly white, very religious, conservative, rural, lots of agricultural work. And I think realizing that and learning from that has taught me a lot about how education was taught to me and how I learned things, and has pushed me to challenge those kinds of narratives and notions and question more about what that disconnect means and why is that happening, and why history is being taught in a way that makes it seem like those things aren't still ongoing. And I think I've learned a lot from that, and that's pushed me to want to be an advocate for justice, more for social justice advocacy, in a way that can make sure that people know that this isn't just something that happened in the past, that things are ongoing and people are still being impacted by that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ella. Jaya?
Yeah, kind of as I touched on with my response to the last question, I was really, really lucky. And I think a lot of this is kind of a stark contrast to like you guys being from more conservative states. So I definitely acknowledge the privilege of growing up in the space that I did. But I think that so much of my learning was very, very, very progressive. And I've learned that, you know, in college now, having conversations with other people and just realizing how lucky I was. For example, Evanston was the first city in the US to fund reparations for Black citizens. And so there are a lot of examples of that, of it just being a pioneer in progressive policies. And so in early high school, when I started to attend protest, especially around the Black Lives Matter movement, I was able to do that learning outside of the classroom as well. And because I was taking courses that were like sociology and history, my educators were teaching those topics with a critical race theory lens, which I think is very unique and kind of unusual to be happening in high school. And because I was taking an interest in that, I had educators that would push me to do readings, whether that was like Angela Davis or stuff like that, that was abolitionist and left wing. So I was pretty lucky in high school to kind of have there. It definitely lined up like what I was taught in class and what I was learning outside of class. So, yeah.
Jude?
So I remember it like this kind of started being apparent in the classroom, just the way that me, in addition to like a lot of my white classmates and teachers, sort of thought about rights. Like I remember reading the Bill of Rights and not getting until the 13th Amendment. I mean, not getting to the 14th that Black Americans were getting citizenship. Never mind that the 13th still allowed for the continuation of slavery in prisons, and then conditions of those prisons almost always violate the Eighth Amendment. But me growing up, I thought of rights as not something more intrinsic, but rather something to be fought for, that you have to fight for. They don't just sort of come. And even when you do have them, they can still a lot of times fail to protect you. So I think for me, it's about looking at, we have rights on paper. How do we ensure that in action? How do we make rights something that is like having rights as a word is something that's meaningful?
Yeah, thank you all for your responses. And I think you all touched on this a little bit, but censorship isn't always an outright ban. So it can also be about what is left unsaid or how different stories are framed, which you all mentioned. We were wondering if you can share an example from school that shaped how you now think about the truth and also access to information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think alongside what I said previously, growing up in a very conservative and rural state and city, not only was education and history taught to me in a way that seemed like violence and harm wasn't still ongoing, I think the perspective of a lot of the history classes and textbooks that I was reading and that we were forced to read in classes were very Eurocentric. We're always prioritizing the perspective of white people, of cultures that weren't indigenous to this nation. And colonization and colonial practices were never centered around indigenous people, which I think as someone who's brown and grew up in a very multicultural and diverse family was really strange to me. The idea that these perspectives of these people who were being harmed and who were being displaced wasn't being centered was something that caused me to challenge that idea, I think, and look deeper into what Indigenous folks' perspectives really were at the time, how history really was, and not through the eyes of colonizers. And since realizing that, how Eurocentric most of history was taught to me, especially in a place where there are so many tribal lands and indigenous peoples that still live here, I've wanted to get more involved in advocacy. I've wanted to learn more about indigenous people and learn why it's important to prioritize their experiences and prioritize what they have to say above people that have displaced them historically. So yeah.
Thank you. Jaya, do you want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ella, brought up something I think about a lot, which is like the idea of the way we were taught about colonization, just like massive, massive gaps, which I still am finding myself like undoing all of the time. And I think with that, I like that idea that you said of like these things are ongoing, first of all. And then also, I feel like a lot of the history classes I took were really focused on like pre-1900s, and the gap of the 1900s to now was not really filled in. I think in, college courses I was taking on world politics for the first time, I really learned in depth about the Vietnam War, the Cold War, definitely the Gulf War. There was never any mention of Israel-Palestine or anything like that. So I feel very lucky to be able to undo some of that, the misconceptions we were taught. And with that, I think so much of that context of world politics is so important to understand like what's happening today. And I don't think you can really fully wrap your head around what's going on now if you don't really understand the things that were happening in those decades of the Cold War, for example. So I think that, I'm constantly feeling the gaps of what was left out of history classes.
And Jaya, you mentioned previously that in Evanston, there was much more progressive education reform in comparison to other what we would call red states, right? And more of an access to information. So you talk a lot about being able to undo those gaps and learn the truth in your higher education experience, especially. I'm curious, though, in Evanston, if you felt like you were able to begin that process through some of your classes in high school, or if most of that work was still done by yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that one of the major limits of like what I could learn about was that a lot of these classes were like AP classes. So the curriculum was set in stone already. And though I had really amazing teachers who would teach the AP courses like with like a critical race theory lens, they were still obviously limited by like the, events or topics that they could discuss. So I think that I started to get exposure and I kind of knew I was on the right track in getting there, especially with the reading and, whatever podcasts I listen to outside of class, stuff like that. But I still feel I am on the path of, you know, learning more, I guess. I feel like I'll never be fully enlightened, and I'm always willing to acknowledge the gaps in my knowledge. So
I feel similarly. I wish I could kind of undo all of the time spent with the AP curriculum. But yes, Jude, go ahead.
I think this might just sound like what Jay and Ella have already said, but I noticed especially with the lack of firsthand experiences when we're talking about historical events, I think what lacked was descriptions of just the violence that a lot of these events and systems were made of. Right, like we never talked explicitly about a lot of the abuse that happened during American slavery. We didn't cover people's experiences after the bombing of Nagasaki. Right, there were these parts that we felt were too uncomfortable to sort of talk about and deal with. Okay, maybe the place for that is not elementary or middle school, but it wasn't really much of that in high school. And I'll be a freshman at Columbia, so we'll see if it's there. But I think that we really just do lose so much of what we're educated about and why we're doing human rights work when we fail to talk about the brutality of that violence. Because when we talk about the people who died, but not talking about how they died, why they died, and who killed them, we're really avoiding overcoming the systems of violence that we are describing and analyzing.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. It's really powerful. So we're now going to switch to individual spotlights. We're going to start with Ella. Ella, can you tell the audience a bit about what Know Your Rights trainings are for those who might not be familiar?
Yeah, of course. So Know Your Rights trainings are community-based sessions that are designed to inform community members, particularly immigrant community members, but is really open to the public and is often helpful for other public members about legal rights that they have in certain situations. I think with the new administration, these have been particularly helpful for immigrants learning what legal rights they have in different situations if they are pulled over by the cops, if they are detained by ICE, if they are in court, what rights that they have, the idea that they have the right to remain silent, that they have the right to an attorney, are all things that we go over, as well as enforcing that folks should carry certain documents if they have different legal statuses. And the idea and main goal of these Know Your Rights trainings are to help inform the public and to empower them with tools that they already have, legal rights that they have and should know about, to protect them and have at their disposal should they need it.
Thank you. Yeah. And in these trainings, you mentioned you meet people who are often learning for the first time what protections they have. How would you say this absence of critical rights education in schools contributes to vulnerability in these immigrant communities?
I think this contributes to a high extent, or this lack of information, I should say, contributes to a high extent of vulnerability among immigrant populations. We see so often at these different trainings that folks don't know about all of these legal protections. They don't know that they're afforded these things when they have different mixed immigration statuses, like we call. That could be that they're in the process of seeking asylum. They're in the process of becoming a legal resident or a citizen. And lots of folks are unaware that they do have all of these rights regardless of their immigration status. And I think this goes to show how a lack of education in public school systems can lead to people not knowing about what they are entitled to. I think these trainings are really powerful and really useful, and people can walk away immediately knowing a couple things that they can keep on hand, things that they can say. But I've also had conversations about how it's unfortunate that we have to do these things, and how if public education systems were structured differently, these rights wouldn't need to be something that we have to explicitly share.
And in your experience, you mentioned you have attended a public school your entire life in Idaho before coming to Columbia University. Were you ever exposed to Know Your Rights trainings, specifically through the public education system? And if not, how did you begin to find out about them?
Through my school system, I really wasn't. And the schools that I went to had a large population of immigrant and refugee students. So if a resource like that should have been available in a place, I would have thought that it would have been some of the schools that I attended, but I never saw that. I never heard of those. And I think instead that allowed me to look for other avenues to learn in my own time, to educate myself, to now be able to be in a position that I can help educate my community. But it is really unfortunate that other kids growing up that don't have that same privilege as me to learn about these things on their own time have to wait to learn about it in their personal time and can't learn about it from their teachers in a public school system that should be teaching about these things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're just starting to touch upon that too. But you've also, working in immigration legislation in Idaho, you've seen how state narratives can erase or distort community realities about public education. So how would you say, how does that compare to the way your own education in Boise portrayed or ignored immigration stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. So working on different immigration-related legislation in Idaho, I've seen how these different official narratives often frame immigration through fear or control perspectives that ignore the complexity and the resilience and the contributions of these different immigrant communities. They often leave out how necessary and vital the roles that immigrants play in Idaho and in the country. These narratives will shape policy and then also will trickle down into public education and curriculum that's taught to students. As I reflect on my education growing up in Boise, I've realized that immigration stories and stories from immigrants were very absent. I think similar to what Jude was touching on, where in learning about history, those first-hand experiences were kind of left out. I felt similarly about learning about immigrant stories. I think we learn about immigrant contribution to some extent growing up in Idaho, but there was very little connection to the lived experiences of immigrants that are in our community, that are living and contributing to the community every single day, especially Latinx communities, especially undocumented students. The stories that I did hear, I felt were very generalized or treated as like an exception, but didn't seem to me like they were presented as the present day reality of Idaho. And I think that disconnect matters when schools are oversimplifying the experiences of immigrants. It kind of emphasizes that exclusion and makes it seem like that's okay and that is normal and commonplace. But yeah, so I think that was really difficult and is more and more apparent to me as I grow older and especially working with legislation in Idaho.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ella. I wish we had more time. I have so many questions for each of you.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program will feature a conversation with Ella, Jude, and Jaya. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, send them to christy@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hens, and production coordinator Jasmine Jizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.